My name is Edward, and for most of my life, I lived in a small farming village in the Scottish Highlands. When I say small, I mean it, so much so that I can tell you exactly everything that was there. Apart from two huge farms with big old houses, owned by the two oldest farmers in the area, there were 6 more houses, a farm store, a small coffee shop, and nothing else. On the outskirts of the village, there was a bus stop, and that was my little portal to civilization for the first 17 years of my life. This reality was also the same for all the children in that village and the other surrounding villages. All my friends lived just like me, with not much to do at home and only a notoriously unreliable bus service to get us out of our little villages. So, when I reached my mid-teens and was finally able to own a car, it became my most prized possession, as it was my golden ticket to freedom. Having my own car was everything I longed for in life. I could finally go anywhere. Sometimes I would leave my boring little town for several days at a time, and all I needed was a little money for gas. For several years, I worked very hard and saved every penny I earned. When I finally had enough, I invested it all in a little 3-door hatchback I had seen at a used car dealership. I remember my mates were almost as happy as I was. The car was nearly new, and after all, they too were going to enjoy the benefits of my new acquisition, and much quicker than they expected. For on the first day it was delivered to me, we all drove to Inverness for the day, went to Domino's, and tried to get served some drinks in one of the local pubs. But all we got was the security guard laughing in our face. Inverness was not a big city or anything like that, and this was only a round trip for a few hours, but so rewarding was this little outing that as soon as we got back to our hometown, we started planning our next adventure. This time, we wanted a slightly more challenging destination, somewhere neither of us had ever been, and that was as far from home as my car could take us. After deliberating for quite a while, we decided that London was the perfect place. Neither of us had ever been to that city, although by then Edinburgh was the center of our world. Well, London seemed like the center of the universe, and we were more than ready to conquer it. So, we prepared for a real lads-on-tour trip, and couldn't wait to start our adventure. However, none of us imagined in a million years the horror movie that awaited us on the road. We had it all planned for the next few months. We would save every penny, and then leave in the summer to make the most of the daylight and good weather. The truth is that the planning stage took us quite some time, and having to prepare for such a big trip made us feel like we were going to star in our own Lord of the Rings spin-off. When it was finally time to pack up everything, we got in the car and headed out on the road. We could hardly contain our excitement. We thought it would be the trip of a lifetime, an unforgettable event that would mark our transition from childhood to adulthood. And the truth is, we weren't even that wrong because, in a way, that's exactly what it was. However, we would never make it to London, but certainly, none of us would ever be the same after this trip. The trip was planned in 2 legs, a 5-hour drive to Blackpool, where we would spend the night in a hotel, and then the next day we would make the remaining 5 hours to London. We chose a travel lodge on the outskirts of town to get some rooms. Actually, driving there was easy enough, but when we arrived, we realized we had made a rather stupid mistake. Instead of booking the rooms and paying in advance, we thought we could just get there and ask for the rooms, but it turned out that they were all booked. So we had no choice but to drive on, in the hope of finding somewhere with a free room or two. But to our absolute horror, everything was booked for the night, and in the end, we had to accept that we had to drive on, which was a risk because I was too exhausted. We finally decided that the best thing to do was to find a place to park and spend the night in the car. We found a small parking spot at a gas station, reclined the seats, and settled in for a few hours of sleep before getting back on the road and heading for London. I'm not sure how long I slept, but I only know that I woke up to one of my friends, Alistair, tapping me on the shoulder insistently, telling me I needed to go to the bathroom. Since my car was only about 3 doors, I had to get out of the car and pull the seat forward so Alistair could get out. At that point, I was still in that little border that divides the dream world and the waking world. But the very fact that he was interrupting my rest put me in a bad mood. I finally got out of the car so that idiot Alistair could go pee behind some bushes that were in a small wood in the vicinity, and the racket we made woke up my other 2 friends, who were not too happy about not being able to sleep either. So I sat on the edge of the driver's seat as I watched Alistair walk into this dark corner of the parking lot. I remember rubbing my eyes, repeating to myself that it would all be worth it when we were finally doing our own thing in London. But at that moment, I heard the bushes rustling, and as I looked in that direction, I could see that Alistair was coming running towards the car at full speed. Before I could say anything, he, with a very pale face, started repeating to me, "Start the car, start the car, start the car quick, start the car." He was saying as he pushed me out of the way so he could get into the back seat again. This obviously had everyone else asking him what his problem was, but he just ignored them and concentrated on telling me that we had to get out of there immediately. Then I realized that whatever had scared him so much was obviously in the bushes in the woods. At that moment, I looked toward that spot, and that's when I saw the shape of a person emerging from the trees. From his appearance, it was clear that it was a man who was walking straight towards us. However, this was not a normal walk, like someone who is going to tell you something nicely. This man was coming fast, taking strong steps, and with a posture that seemed very intimidating. I didn't know what the hell had happened in his little encounter with Alistair, but it didn't look good, especially since, upon noticing his presence, my friend started freaking out in the back seat, desperately repeating that we should leave immediately. I know this will sound a bit selfish, but the first thing that went through my mind was that I would damage my car, and this thought alone was what made me turn the key in the ignition like a madman. As soon as I did, I stepped on the accelerator, and we sped out of the parking lot towards the main road. Once we seemed to be safe, we all started yelling at Alistair to explain to us how the hell he managed to make someone so angry in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, and in less than 10 minutes. I must tell you that Alistair was the joker of the group, and sometimes he made people upset with his nonsense. He just couldn't help it. So he was always getting us in trouble at home. That's why our first hypothesis was that he did one of his annoying bits, and, with his stupid little jokes in bad taste, got us kicked out of our place to sleep. But when we started to reproach him for this, my friend almost went crazy with the accusation. He completely denied being rude to anyone and told everyone to shut up so he could explain what had really happened. But when he said what had actually happened, it was something so creepy it was like something out of a horror movie, and for a moment we thought he was just pulling our leg. But he wasn't. We knew him well enough to know he wasn't lying, plus the panic could be seen on his face. What Alistair told us was, "Guys, I swear to God, what I'm saying is absolutely true. I think I just witnessed a murder." So it was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and we were on a quiet stretch of highway somewhere between Manchester and Liverpool, and we were all listening intently when my friend started to tell what happened in the bushes. He related that he went a little further into the bush for some privacy, and just as he was about to take his bobby out, he heard something not too far away from him. He didn't want to start peeing until he knew he was alone, so he went a little further into the bushes, trying to figure out what it was and where the sound was coming from. He said it sounded like something was hitting a pillow or something, like those muffled thumps that lined up with someone making soft grunts and groans. Now, if your mind is picturing a scene that matches this kind of description, well, Alistair's thought exactly the same thing. So he kept looking for the sound, thinking he was about to catch two rascals doing their thing hiding in the bushes. But what he actually found was something very different. When he reached the place, what he saw in the middle of the darkness he could only describe as a guy kneeling over another, who seemed to be beating his fist against the chest of the other, who was lying face up on the ground, while the latter was not emitting any sound. And that's when Alistair realizes that the guy is not only hitting the other with his fist, but he has a knife in his hand. That is, he was not hitting him, he was stabbing him. When my friend finally realized what he was presenting, he said he must have made a noise, like a muffled scream, and that was the signal that the scary man we saw in the parking lot turned to him, and that was the signal that he needed to run out of the place and back to the car. When Alistair finished telling us this horror story, we all just stared at each other in disbelief. Only this time, it wasn't so much because we didn't believe him, but because we didn't want to believe him. But we knew he wasn't lying this time. But while we are still trying to take in what had just happened, I looked to my rear-view mirror and saw a pair of headlights approaching my rear bumper very, very fast. At that moment, I tuned out of the conversation for a moment. In a second, I look at the headlights and expect them to start passing me, but they didn't. And the next thing I know, those headlights were so close and so bright, they illuminated the entire interior of my car. This then caught the guy's attention, and as I'm panicking, wondering what the hell this other driver is thinking, I hear Alistair yell, "It's him, it's him, it's him," and a split second later, wham, the driver accelerates and rear-ends my car, almost sending me off the road. We all started screaming in terror, but I managed to keep my hands fixed on the steering wheel and just barely kept control of the car. Another hit like that, and I might not be able to stay on the road. It was like being trapped in this horrible dead end. I accelerated the car and desperately tried to escape, but the driver hit my rear bumper again, and this unsettled me even more. At that moment, I let off the accelerator, trying to regain control of the car. I even thought about stopping and confronting whoever this guy was. After all, we were four and he was only one. But then, just what I feared happened. The car hit us for the third time, and this time he concentrated all his force on one side of my bumper, which caused me to completely lose control of the car. Although I did everything I could to keep us on the road, we ended up smashing loudly into a metal barrier on the side, and the car went down a small slope on the other side of the road, flipping over a couple of times in the process. I just remember closing my eyes tightly, still with my hands gripping the steering wheel, and thinking, God, this is how I'm going to die, as I waited for the final blow. However, when the car finally stopped turning, and my body stopped being hit and jolted, I realized that I was still alive and conscious, sore all over, but alive, and I was very grateful for that. And I was even more so when I heard the complaints and curses of each of my friends, for that let me know that they were alive too. Thank God, somehow we were lucky enough to land with the wheels down. The first thing I did was to turn off the car engine, as there was smoke coming out from under the hood. And suddenly, I realized that I could smell gasoline. That's when I knew we were in serious trouble. At that moment, we all started trying to escape, but the doors were completely sealed and crushed by the rollover, so we were trapped. But then Igor, one of my friends in the back, started kicking the back glass, which amazingly was still in one piece, and that's how we managed to escape and get to safety. Fortunately, the car never burst into flames, but it was still unusable. Another fortunate fact is that the driver of the car that hit us was gone. I guess he assumed we were not going to survive. But now we had another problem, and that was that it was 1991, and cell phones were not in everyday use as they are today, which meant that if we wanted to contact the police, We had to find a phone on the road that could be used in case of emergencies, or we had to wait for another driver to pass by so we could send him for help. Only two of us, Dylan and I, were in a position to be able to walk anywhere to get help, but that meant leaving Alistair and Igor alone on the side of the road. But we dreaded the thought of the guy who ran us off the road wanting to come back and finish the job, and then finding our friends there completely helpless. We knew that if the guy was really trying to get rid of the witnesses, he wouldn't hesitate for a minute to hurt them both, or even stay and wait for us to come back. Fortunately, however, that didn't happen, because just as we deliberated about leaving or staying, a car came around the bend and we started signaling for help. The driver stopped, and as luck would have it, this woman just happened to have one of those old-fashioned cell phones that looked like a brick and had an antenna on the end. So she was able to contact the police for us, and we almost begged her to stay until they arrived. And although the van that ran us off the road did not return, we were terrified that the guy would come back to finish the job he had started. In the end, we all spent the rest of the night in a hospital, with 2 police officers hanging around to listen to all of our statements. By the end of the night, each of us had a collection of sprains, bumps, and all sorts of other injuries, but nothing that a few days' rest couldn't fix. We really were very fortunate to get out of that terrible incident with only superficial injuries. That night, I was able to call my mom and dad from the hospital, and although they were horrified by the news that we had crashed, they were as relieved as we were to learn that we had come out of it all mostly unscathed. Sadly, all our effort of months and months of work had been almost a waste, a complete waste of time. But somehow, given the gravity of the situation, I didn't feel like I had really lost anything, really. I mean, I still had my health, all my mates were okay, and although I lost my prized car, I could still borrow my dad's if I ever really needed it. Sometime later, we discovered that the police had found evidence of a violent crime near the parking lot where we had been trying to sleep. They didn't find the body, but there was enough blood to corroborate Alistair's story about seeing a person being stabbed. As for the van that rammed us, it was found about a week later abandoned in a wood on the other side of Manchester. There were blood stains inside, and the registration matched one that had been in the same parking lot. Overall, we had narrowly avoided being silenced forever as witnesses to a murder. But beyond that, we didn't know much else for quite some time, and we had no idea if they ever caught the guy who chased us. But then, almost a year later, we learned that the victim that night was a co-owner of a construction company, and this one had recently taken his partner to court for some kind of fraud. And shortly after the body was found, this conman partner disappeared completely and immediately became the prime suspect in the murder of his partner. That was the guy who chased us in his truck, and Alistair had witnessed the exact moment he was finishing off the partner he had robbed. But the surprise of the case is that Alistair had been wrong about the killer stabbing his partner in the chest, as it later transpired that the actual cause of death was strangulation, which makes everything even more macabre, as the guy had brought a knife with him because he wanted to make it as difficult as possible for the police to identify the body of his partner. So it was not in the chest that he stabbed him, but in the face. But everything was too dark for Alistair to see clearly that in reality, the victim was being stabbed in the face. This story happened a long time ago, over 30 years today. So my 3 old friends, as well as myself, are now married, have children, and live elsewhere. So we don't get to see each other as much as we would like to. But from time to time, we get together in our old village, which is now much more populated and has several pubs that we take the opportunity to frequent. At those times, tempers are always high during these get-togethers, but at some point, the conversation inevitably turns to the accident, and how lucky we were to make it home alive after that, when there was one guy who never made it back to his. A few years ago, I took a road trip to hike several major parks in the country. I'm a big fan of hiking, So I've been to a lot of interesting places, and this particular trip was very important to me as it took me to a lot of new and incredible places. However, I also can't forget a scary incident that happened to me on the road while heading to my first destination, and thanks to which this trip almost never happened. This was my second night on the road. I was driving on the highway, and it was quite late. In fact, I was the only car on the road for quite a while until I suddenly noticed a car coming up behind me. I was in the right lane, and the car moved into the left lane to pass me, but when it caught up to the speed I was going, instead of passing me, it pulled alongside me. Suddenly, I noticed something with my peripheral vision and saw out of the corner of my eye the driver of the car. This was a bald guy wearing sunglasses, something that caught my attention immediately as it was nighttime, and these glasses looked quite dark. The man had rolled down the front passenger side window and was waving at me, and when I turned to look, he started making some movements with his arms. I rolled down the window and realized that he was also saying something. It seemed to me that he was indicating that something was wrong with my car. He was yelling, but I couldn't hear a single word he was saying because we were going too fast. And I knew this guy was not someone who knew me, as we were several states away from where I lived, and his face didn't look at all familiar either. While I was analyzing what he could possibly want to tell me, he continued yelling at me and making movements with his hands. I thought that something must be wrong with my car. I don't know, maybe I had a flat tire and I hadn't noticed, although everything seemed fine to me. I looked at my check engine light and it wasn't on. I'm not a car expert, but I really didn't feel there was anything strange. Still, I was convinced that this man saw something that I didn't, but I had no idea what he was trying to warn me about. I decided to take the next exit coming up on the right, so I slowed down and the man stayed beside me. Then I took the exit and the man followed me in his car. That's when I saw a gas station about a mile ahead and decided to stop there. I pulled into the gas station, which was the only thing in that area, and when I did, I saw that there was no one else there. I parked my car, and the guy parked next to me. Then we both got out of our vehicles, and when we did, the man came up to me and told me that something was wrong with my car. I immediately asked him what it was, logically, and then he told me that he saw it emitting black smoke from the exhaust. This really weirded me out, so I asked what that meant, and he told me it meant something was very wrong with the engine. Then he told me to get in his car, that he would take me to the nearest mechanic, and he would fix it. When he mentioned this, it really gave me a bad feeling. I had a bad feeling, and I certainly didn't want to go anywhere with this guy. So I asked him to wait and tried to get him to explain more about the problem. He explained something about it being major engine damage that needed to be checked as soon as possible and insisted once again that I go with him to get the mechanic. But this was too weird. It was almost midnight. What mechanic would be working at that hour? This immediately started to smell bad to me. Although the guy at no time showed aggressive behavior, there was something that didn't fit. I mean, why the eagerness for me to get into his car? Besides, at that moment, I moved to the back of my car to look at the exhaust pipe, and then I realized that it was perfectly chrome-plated. I mean, if my car was emitting black smoke, then that would be reflected in the exhaust. It should be stained black. I bent down and stuck my fingers inside, looking for traces of the smoke, but there was nothing. I stand up, and I'm about to turn to the guy to tell him there was no smoke. But as I turned in his direction, I felt a sharp blow to the left side of my face. This left me completely dazed, and when I try to straighten up, I feel the second blow, which almost threw me to the floor. But even as dazed as I was, I could anticipate the third blow, so I managed to dodge it. It is at that moment that I realized that the guy was hitting me with a bottle of alcohol. However, this miraculously had not broken with the impact, but looking at my hands, completely wet and stained red, I realized that my face had been cut. At that moment, He lunges towards me once again, with the intention of hitting me again with the bottle, but I managed to tackle his arm, so the bottle flew out of his hand and crashed on the pavement. At that instant, I was distracted, and the man grabbed my arm, bending it behind my back, and then the other arm wrapped around my neck and began to strangle me. I didn't really understand what was going on with this man or why he was doing this. All I knew was that I had to do something to get out of his grip, or in less than a minute I would be a dead man. That's when I gave him a hard stomp on the foot, which made him loosen his grip a little, and then I took the opportunity to give him a couple of punches in the face, one of which I'm sure fractured his nose, as I could clearly feel his septum crunch under my fist. And without giving him time to react, I gave him a strong kick in the groin, which made him fall kneeling on the floor and then on his side, rolling in on himself from the pain while he was hurling insults at me. I quickly took advantage of that small advantage to jump into my car, and I put the gas pedal to the metal and got back on the road at full speed. While I was on the road, I quickly called 911 and drove to the nearest hospital, which was several miles ahead of me, all the while looking in my rear mirror every few moments to make sure he wasn't following me. But fortunately, I never saw the lights of his car again. After driving for quite a while, I finally arrived at the hospital, and it was then, when I could see my reflection in the emergency glass door, that I was shocked. My face was completely bloodied, as well as my clothes, but fortunately, the wound was only superficial, and only a few stitches and a few painkillers were necessary. That same night, I went to the police station and informed them of the attack, explained in detail what happened, and gave them a description of the man. However, I never found out if he was arrested or not, nor what the motive of his attack was, or what he intended to do with me that night. The truth is that as unfortunate and frightening as this was, I was not going to let a sneaky madman on the road rue in a trip I had planned for so many months. So I continued on my way and was finally able to complete my route as I had planned, albeit with a little extra pain from stitches and bruises. My name is James, and I am going to tell you about one of the most terrifying experiences I have had in the almost 20 years I have been a cab driver. It was still early in the day, and I had already driven a couple to the bus station, and now I had a service to the airport. Fortunately, things were looking up from the previous 4 days. The fare was in an upper-class neighborhood, something I really appreciated because those people often tip big if they got a quick ride to their place of origin. It took me 7 minutes to arrive, a real record, so I'd probably earned a decent tip for this service. When I arrived, no one was outside waiting, so I made a quick whistle with my horn, and a moment later, a beautiful blonde poked her head out of the upstairs window. Just a minute, she told me, but knowing women's timing, I knew it could be more, so I slid the transmission into park and leaned back quietly in my seat. That summer of 1981, it was hot as hell. Even with the air conditioning on, I was still drenched in sweat. A few minutes later, the pretty blonde came out and got into the cab, but she wasn't alone. A dirty, long-haired man came out with her, and when they got to the car, I quickly realized they were addicts. "Where's your luggage? Let's go to the airport," I told the girl. Then they looked at each other for a second before replying, "It's already there." I shrugged and turned away. It wasn't my job to read the minds of drug addicts. I started the cab, and for most of the ride, not much was said. Occasionally, they would whisper things to each other, but nothing of the volume I could hear. Every now and then, I would glance at the blonde through the rear-view mirror. She caught me looking at her a couple of times and smiled each time. But each time she showed her now decayed teeth, I felt a little twinge of sadness. She had obviously been a beautiful woman before the drug took over her life. You could still see this when I looked at her from afar, But as she got closer, the deep wrinkles and open sores she showed made her vices very obvious. These were my thoughts, which were interrupted by the escort, who said to me, "Hey man, there was a change of plans. We are going to need you to take us somewhere else, somewhere else." As I was casually saying this, the guy pointed to a sign with his head. "We need you to go over the viaduct to puncture." These words really pissed me off, and of course, I wasn't going to change course, least of all to get high. Besides, I knew the area around there was dangerous. "Listen, kid, I'm really sorry, but once we set a destination, we can't just change it because we can. It's a safety rule. If you want, at the airport, you can take another cab, and then you can take it wherever you want." Of course, this wasn't entirely true. Of course, I could change the route as long as I called to inform dispatch. The fact was that I wasn't going anywhere near that place, and most likely no other driver would. I glanced in the rear-view mirror as I told him this, and then I noticed the blonde whispering something to him, and I also noticed a smile grow on her face as she said it, and an air of confidence began to emanate from both of them. They certainly confused me. I wasn't sure if they understood what I said, or maybe all the drugs they had been on had finally fried their brains. Then the guy says to me, "Hey man, I don't think you understood. You have to take us to where I told you, and it has to be now." This was said in a very arrogant tone, and it made me laugh. However, when I looked in the mirror, I knew the reason for his haughtiness, and that is that he had a .38 caliber revolver in his hands, and he was pointing it right at me. Now it all made sense. These bastards probably never intended to go to the airport, and they knew that if they said anything about going through that area, they would never have sent me. But that didn't mean anything anymore. Now I had to do what they told me to do, and I hoped they wouldn't shoot me in the process. "Okay, I got the point. Can you put the gun down? I'll take you to do what you want." They both chuckled when I said that, and the guy lowered the gun to his lap. "Well, I'm glad we understand each other now." And he pointed again to the viaduct exits, and I understood that the viaduct was nothing more than a big bridge that carried traffic over the railroad tracks below. It had always been the artery connecting the safest and most productive part of town with the crime, ridden hollow on the other side of the tracks. That's why we never went over it, and I hadn't until that day. As I entered that horrible place, uneasy feelings began to well up in my gut. First of all, I wasn't really sure what the area was like as I entered the viaduct. I had never been there before. And as I got to where they pointed me, probably to buy their vices, I felt really nervous. I don't think I have words to describe it, other than to say that it was the living image of decadence. I could see many addicts wandering like zombies, people living in really deplorable conditions, children clearly malnourished, and an image that horrified me and broke my heart at the same time. A woman addict that was very noticeable, sitting at the entrance of a dilapidated shack with a baby, almost in the bones just like her, glued to her chest, a truly heartbreaking image and hard to forget. I asked my captors where I was, but they seemed very amused by my growing nervousness. The guy told me I still had a few more laps to go. We drove even further into the suburb and then stopped at a house where a couple of shirtless, tattooed guys, each with a gun inside his pants, approached my car. This made my bile rise in my mouth. I swear I had never been so nervous in my entire life. They gave him what seemed to be several bags full of substances, you know, that crap they consume. But what terrified me the most about this situation is that they started talking about sales and routes, and they were calling each other by their names, something that never happens with dealers when there is someone else, unless, of course, that someone is not going to live to tell on them. At that point, my panic was only growing. All I could think was that I was going to die in that place, where I might never be found, and my wife would never know what happened to me. At one point, one of the dealers started sniffing around my car and tells the other that it's a good machine, and that it's just what they need to do the tonight thing. I swear I had never felt so panicked in my life, as that seemed to be confirmation that they would take my car and finish me off. After that, both dealers got into my car, and we began a tour of the deepest and most decadent nooks and crannies imaginable while they traded their wares. This went on for about 2 or 3 hours, and then one of the guys says to the guy who kidnapped me, "It's time." After that, the 2 guys got out of the car and went into a house, and the blonde and the dirty guy took me to a secluded place almost at the end of an alley. At that moment, everything was silent. Only some kids playing with a soccer ball could be heard in the distance. I remember thinking, this is the end they had planned for me. My thoughts went to my family. I was waiting for my wife to be notified somehow. I didn't know if I would recover my body or stay in this cab rotting for God knows how long. Finally, the one who kidnapped me spoke. "Take off your watch, wallet, and ring and put it in your wallet. On your way back to Anna, and don't turn around when you do so." So that was the blonde's name. She was definitely going to die. I did my best not to let them see me shaking, so I did when I gave them what they asked for, but of course, I could feel the shaking. She let out a little giggle as she took the things. They had everything they needed, but then he said, "Now give me the keys to the cab." And that was probably the most terrifying thing. They were going to shoot me and take my cab. It looked like my wife was never going to be able to bury me after all. I did my best to hide the tears. I could hear the couple starting to move in the back. I was terrified to look in the mirror. I didn't want to see it coming. I took a big breath of air and closed my eyes as I waited for the shot of Grace. And at that moment, an image of my wife popped into my mind. She was wearing a beautiful little red dress I had bought her for our anniversary. Her hair was up, and she was sitting on our couch. It was the most beautiful thing I had seen her in since our first date. And with that perfect image, I prepared to say goodbye to my life. While I was in the state of pure resignation, the sound of a car door opening came from behind me, but I ignored it. This was too wonderful a sight to leave. But the sounds of people running shortly thereafter woke me up from my fantasy. I was too scared to turn around at first, so I slowly opened my eyes and looked at the farthest point of my vision, and then I could perceive that the door at the rear passenger side was open. So I mustered all the courage I had to look in my rear-view mirror. In doing so, I realized that there was no one there. So I finally turned around, and the greatest sense of relief I have ever felt in my life took over my body. They didn't want to kill me. They had what they needed, and they were gone. At that moment, I didn't care about anything. I was just happy to be alive. For the next few minutes, I stood with my forehead resting on the steering wheel, crying and thanking God for this second chance, and basically celebrating my life, until the weight of the situation washed over me, and I realized that I was still there. Alive or not, I didn't want to be in this neighborhood for one more second, let alone now it was about to get dark. I immediately put my car in gear, praying that what fuel I had left would be enough to get to the nearest station and fill up the tank. I put the car in gear and tried to get out of there as soon as possible. And I swear I made the greatest effort in the world to find a way out of that horrible labyrinth of twisting streets that became my personal hell. When I finally managed to get out, I felt as if a ton of bricks were lifted off my back, and everything I had experienced that afternoon seemed to be the product of a nightmare, the worst nightmare I have ever had in my life. That night, I went to the police station and reported what had happened, but only after I got home and gave my wife the biggest and longest hug. At that moment, I felt as if my soul was rebooted and the world stopped. I couldn't feel happier and relieved. Sometime later, my captors were caught and imprisoned, but of the other evildoers I heard nothing. They were probably still at large, but I never saw them again in my life, let alone return to that horrible place. Hi, my name is Angelo. I've been a cab driver for 10 years, and just a couple of months ago, I had the strangest, creepiest experience I've had in all my years as a professional driver. I picked up this middle-aged, well-dressed, good-looking guy at a bus terminal, but when he opened his mouth, he said the strangest things I've ever heard. But at the same time, he planted a seed of doubt that lingers in my mind to this day. And what started as an entertaining conversation ended with a shiver running through my body from head to toe. And today, I will relate in detail everything I remember about this encounter. On Saturday nights, I usually work in what I call the cemetery. That is, the places where people usually go to bury their sorrows. That is, bars, discos, casinos, and nightclubs of all kinds. And my rates are usually higher at night, too. But this was an unusual day. That night, I had just dropped off two very drunk girls at their houses. One of them, which was a pretty red-headed girl, tells me that she didn't have enough change for a tip. But to make up for that, she decided it was a good idea to show me her boobs, something I didn't dislike, but I didn't ask her either. And in all honesty, I would have preferred my tip, although I must admit they were nice. But anyway, the thing is that it was around 3:00 a.m. when I passed in front of the bus terminal. This is within my usual work area, since it is practically in the center of the city, and almost all the clubs, casinos, and night spots are around it. The thing is that night, as I was passing by after dropping off this pair of girls, I noticed a tall, well-dressed man waving at me and motioning for me to stop. As an experienced cab driver, I know that a man in a sharp suit late at night is just as good a tip, so I didn't hesitate to stop and heed his call. Once he got into the car and closed the door, he removed a stylish hat he was wearing. The guy was dressed like a movie star, and he was out of place. I mean, when I saw him closer, I thought his style was kind of old-fashioned. In fact, from a distance he looked older, but upon closer inspection, I realized he must not have been more than 30 or 35 years old. At first, I feared I had picked up a time traveler because he looked like a movie star from the 1950s. As is now customary for me, I did the usual. I asked him where he was going. His answer took me a bit by surprise. He said, "I don't really know. I'm in town on business, and I'm looking for someone to show me around." I found this answer so bizarre that it made me laugh. It seemed too late for a sightseeing trip. But like the professional I am, I said, "Hey, as long as you pay me, sir, I'll take you anywhere you want." And that's how this all started. In about 2 hours, I showed him everything he had to see of the city, the most important spots, and everything a newcomer should know in this city. I remember that I gave him a tour of the university, the Capitol building, the parks, the most important restaurants and hotels, and also several night spots in case he liked to have fun. But at some point during our little tour, I remember he commented that he was in town on business, so I asked him, "What kind of business do you do, if you can tell, of course?" Again, his answer was so strange that it made me laugh. The guy was definitely a born comedian. He replied, "Well, I'm what people would call a hitman. The truth is that I had been having such a good time with this passenger so far that I decided to play along. I thought it was kind of funny. So I said, 'Okay, sir, I'll play along. So tell me, how does the business work? I mean, do they have a phone number that you can get in touch with them, like you can find it in the directory or something?' Kind of a silly question for a funny situation, you know." He said, "Well, a woman contacted me now through another client. Obviously, my number is not publicly available, but I can be contacted through third parties." Okay, good answer. And then how would the business be?" I asked him. "It's simple. She gives me names, photos, and any information I ask for that might be useful to me to do a good job. And if I decide to do the job after that, we move on to the money. If we agree on an amount, then I will work with everything, but in complete anonymity." After this, I asked him how he made sure he got paid after hurting someone. Apparently, he found my choice of words very funny and started laughing quite a bit. He replied, "It probably wouldn't be wise at all to reveal that part to him, because we professionals have to keep some secrets to ourselves." Well, okay. So how does a client know that you have completed the job? I regretted asking the question even before I finished asking it. But even though it was a stupid question, he still had an answer for me, but with a hint of sarcasm in his voice. Well, my dear gentleman, we live in an age with a 24-hour news cycle on multiple media and social networks, don't you think? If your father died suddenly, someone would contact your mother first, but if you don't find out on your own, someone will tell you. Once I get paid, my relationship with the client ends. She's finally on her own after that. The last part of his answer made me think of another question. What if something goes wrong? If she gets arrested or implicated in the deed, what do you do? He thought for a moment before answering. I imagine he was considering how much he should tell a stranger driving his cab. But then he continued. Well, at some point, contingencies are in place to protect me. First, if I did my job right, the client shouldn't have any information about me to give to the police, and if I happen to screw up so badly that she can do it, I have multiple exit strategies. I certainly won't let the police get their hands on me, but at the end of the day, none of us live forever. I must confess that there were a few times within our little fictional conversation where I had to remind myself that this was all a game, but he made it fun, and truth be told, his imagination and foresight left me quite amazed. We had been playing this game for hours before it occurred to me to ask him how he got started in this business, and again, his answer left me very surprised. I joined the military right out of high school and saw that my work caught the attention of my superiors. They referred me to a couple of gentlemen in the government, and I worked for them for 10 years before I came to the decision to start a business on my own. I remember telling the guy that he was very good at this stuff and that he should really consider being a storyteller if that's not what he actually did for a living. I told him I'm very impressed. The truth is, this was the most fun I'd ever had driving a cab in my life. I was used to dealing with drunks and arrogant businessmen, so this was a wonderful and almost cathartic interaction. Well, thank you, young man, he said to me, and then continued, I appreciate everything you've shown me tonight, by the way. It was then that I realized he was talking about the night coming to an end. The sun was about to rise soon, and I was starting to flag. But I took the opportunity to ask one last question, one I should have asked much earlier. You had told me earlier tonight that you were in town on business. Did that mean you are here to kill someone? At that moment, a mischievous smile appeared on his face as he thought about his answer, and then he said, well, as a matter of fact, I was. However, I got a message at the last minute to call off the hit, and I can keep the half she had already given me, so I didn't mind. This is business, and it happens from time to time. After all, it is a woman's prerogative, isn't it, to change her mind. I hope she and her husband work it out anyway. I finished my service with this client just as the first rays of the sun appeared on the horizon. Then he pointed to where he would be staying. There were a few hotels at the end of the parking lot, and I assumed that was where he was headed. Upon arrival, he handed me $1,000, and before I could argue, he told me to keep the change. This was more than double what I owed, but I was too tired to disagree. Keep the change, kid, you earned it. I had a great time tonight. Thank you, sir. I had a great time too, and thank you most of all for the incredible story you related to me. He got out of the car after these shared words, but before he did, he said one last thing that left me completely frozen. Thanks for showing me around tonight, Angelo. Take good care of Mia and stay out of trouble. This while giving me a couple of pats on the shoulder. I left the parking lot and headed home. My hope was that Mia would have breakfast ready, but that's when what this man had just said hit me like a hammer. How did that guy know my name, not to mention my wife's? My license was nowhere where he could have seen it. I recreated the night's conversation in my head, and there was never a point where I told him anything that would have ruined the game. I didn't ask him his name, and there was no reason to tell him mine, let alone my wife's. And how did he know I was married anyway? I hadn't worn a ring in years. lost it in a sewer and never found it, I guess. I also couldn't have guessed that. The problem was that Mia and I had just gotten back together last week. Because we had been separated for several months and had been considering divorce for 2 years before that. As I pulled into the driveway, a terrible thought crossed my mind. Was there any chance that this guy wasn't just making up a story, and that everything he told me in the car really was true? And what if this man was serious? So the fact that he knew my name and my wife's name could only mean one thing. Even if it was true, I wasn't ready to accept it. That morning, as Mia and I sat and ate breakfast, I couldn't help but look at her the whole time with doubt. I was terrified to think that my wife would have wanted me dead, even if she had changed her mind. There was no way I could accept it. Would she really be capable of something like that? I thought about asking for a moment, but she would never admit it. And if she did, I really wasn't prepared for that answer. I just stayed silent while she kindly brought me a dessert, and for a second I hesitated to try it, but she offered it to me with such sweetness that I didn't see how to refuse it. Since that day, I have tried to forget the matter for my own mental health. But that seed of doubt that this man planted in my mind that night is still very much alive to this day. Perhaps someday I will muster the courage to speak to my wife about it. But for now, I prefer to keep these thoughts to myself.